Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio with your hosts, Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio, the flagship show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host for the evening, Mark Johnson, and I'm joined tonight by our guest co-host, Andy Mercer. How are you tonight, Andy?
Hello, Mark. I'm doing pretty well. Another English accent, but I'm definitely not Irene. So it's slightly different tonight.
Yes, well, Irene, as we mentioned last week, she is headed out to Amalfi, Italy for her holiday. Where they're having 40 plus degree centigrade temperatures. That's almost 120 out here for us Americans. And so she's going to roast her ass off, and I'm going to laugh the entire time. So, Irene, we really hope you have a good time out there sweating. Anyway, she's going to have a good time. It's so beautiful on the Amalfi Coast. I've never been there, but I've seen so many of the pictures. Have you ever been to Italy?
To Rome. I was there last October for my wedding anniversary, actually. I absolutely loved it. It's a fantastic city, and Italy itself seemed quite amazing. We really enjoyed our stay. Rome itself is quite chaotic, I have to say. One of the things we noticed that was quite amazing was the way people parked. It was just like, oh, there's a space. It's the middle of the road, but there's a space. I'll just stick my car there and park and wander off. It was quite incredible, but I absolutely loved the visit there. But it's somewhere I wanted to go for a long time. But to go in its 40-odd degrees, I'm not so sure that's for me, really. That's a little too much on the warm side, I have to say.
I'd be down in the water, in the ocean, the entire time. You couldn't get me out of the water. I'd be pruned, but it's better than, sweating to death.
Definitely. I mean, it was still, even in October in Rome, when the sun came out, it was quite warm. But I absolutely loved it there. Funny enough, my neighbours here, where I live over in Essex in the UK, they're actually Italian, and the husband, if you like, is from Rome. So he said, next time you go, let me know and I'll head over there and we can meet up. I can take you on a grand tour, because there are some, as you imagine, amazing sites in Rome itself, not just obviously things like the Colosseum, which you all know about, and of course that funny church they call the Vatican that's over one side, but there's lots of very interesting sites that you wouldn't necessarily know about if you were just a tourist, going on your average kind of tourist field trip. So there's sort of little hidden places and little hidden gems that are quite amazing as well. In fact, one of the places we did visit on our tour, we did like a little tour of eateries. My wife and I both love Italian food. We went this eating tour, basically, was the oldest existing synagogue in Rome. It's not a synagogue anymore. It's now a restaurant, but its cellars where they store the wine go back to Roman times, and they've had ghosts actually been reported down in those cellars. Members of staff have seen people dressed in Roman uniforms sort of walking through the room. That's absolutely fascinating. So there are a lot of hidden gems in Rome itself that are well worth going to see. I mean, I don't work for the Rome Tourist Board or anything, but I do love Italy, so I'm quite envious, but I wouldn't go in that kind of heat, that's for definite.
No, you go in the off season when it's a little cooler. Yeah, a little more comfortable. That's on my bucket list. I've got to get out and see Rome, see Europe, see other parts of the world, because while North America is a beautiful continent, you know what? There's so much more out there to see. So, Irene, I'm officially jealous. You have a good time. We'll keep an eye on Gertie while you're gone. At least we won't have any snoring during tonight's show.
Well, certainly not from this end, anyway.
So let's go ahead and let's introduce our guest. I'm really excited to introduce tonight's guest. I've been wanting to speak with this gentleman for a very long time. I've been fascinated with his work. He is an Egyptologist, and he has written or helped co-write over a dozen books on the subject of Egypt and how it relates, the alternative histories that are just now becoming more popular in the mainstream. He is also a regular contributor to the television show Ancient Aliens. So we want to welcome Robert Bauval to the program tonight. Robert, thank you very much for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure, Mark and Andy.
Now, again, I've been following you for the last several years. I've been really intrigued whenever you have appeared on the Ancient Aliens show. The two people that have been on that show that I've really connected with the most is yourself and Philip Coppens. I've had the opportunity to speak with Philip a few times before he passed. I was really upset when he died. That was very unexpected, and I like the approach that you take, and of course the vast knowledge that you have of ancient Egypt, and the what's coming out is the true history that is been suppressed by the mainstream historians and archaeologists about what's really going on in Egyptian history and humanity's history. With your books, the Egypt Code, and of course the Orion
Mysteries.
The Orion Mysteries, yes, thank you. Which correlates the layout of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau in the same layout as Orion's Belt. What made you could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you started to understand that things were not quite what the normal historians have been promoting all these years?
Sure. Just a few corrections. I'm not an Egyptologist. My readers know this very well. I'm a construction engineer turned amateur Egyptologist. I think that's the best way.
Okay.
I say this because I'm seen by many Egyptologists as the Ralph Naylor of Egyptology. So I don't think they'll appreciate me being part of their group. Having said this, I got into this quite in a very indirect way. I mean, I was, like I said, I was a construction engineer for many years. At the time when it all started for me, I was employed in Saudi Arabia with a large consortium of construction companies, and my mother was still living in Egypt. You may or may not know that I was born in Egypt.
Yes, I knew that.
In the city of Alexandria. I grew up there. I left when I was nearly 20. But my mother stayed on. My father died in Egypt when I was a teenager. So I used to take trips to Egypt and go and see her in Alexandria. And on this particular trip, it was 1983. I don't know what prompted me to go visit again the Cairo Museum, the Egyptian ancient Egyptian Cairo Museum. And there, my attention was drawn to a photograph on the wall. This story is well known. I've told it so many times, but so let me skim over it very quickly. But I was intrigued by an aerial photograph of the pyramids, of the Giza pyramids. And being trained as a setting out engineer in my early days, setting out engineers are those guys who go with theodolites and dumpy levels and measuring tapes, and so things that don't look straight to me, I pick them up very quickly. And I was intrigued by the layout of the pyramids. The three pyramids, there was two large pyramids running on a diagonal. The third smaller one was offset, and I just asked a question. I call it my apple that fell on my head, the Newtonian apple. I asked the question, why is it this way? Why are we having a smaller pyramid offset? Anyway, that's how it began for me. Very quickly, I developed a taste for the Egyptian antiquities. I started buying books and again, by strange fluke, I'm very much into synchronicity these days, because when I look back at how things locked into place for me. Anyway, I was visiting a friend in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, and he had just come from Egypt as well, and he had bought one of these coffee table books. And as we were having a casual conversation, I fluttered through the pages of the book, and I fell on a picture of the pyramid texts. And there was a quotation from the text. I'm paraphrasing here. That the king went to the constellation of Orion as a spirit, and that kind of got into the thought processes that we're having. I was trying to explain this reason for the layout of the pyramids. I was thinking about Orion, and on the night camping in the desert, a friend of mine who was a navigator in those days. I'm talking long before GPSs and Google Earth and all these wonderful things we have today. Said that he would navigate and find true east by looking at the rising of the constellation of Orion, particularly the belt stars of Orion. And he just casually said, look, there's 3 stars, but the little one is offset and the penny dropped, the proverbial penny dropped. And I realized I was looking at a kind of map in the sky. And so, of course, I got very involved with. First, I tried to find out if anybody knew about this. It was not easy. This was again before. My God, in 1983. This was before we even had faxes, and I somehow managed to contact a very prominent Egyptologist, Sir Ivan Edwards, by letter, and he was very intrigued by this idea. So on the next trip to England. He lived in Oxford at the time. He had just retired. I went to see him, and he encouraged me to publish. I published an article, and then, well, one thing led to another. Eventually, I published a book in '94. The BBC got interested, and it all went crazy after that. There you are.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster ride since, and then especially in the last, oh my God, how long has Ancient Aliens been on now? Several years now. That's really sparked a lot of interest in those theories.
Yes. Ancient Aliens is a bit sort of very recent for me, because when my book got published in '94, really there wasn't not many production companies were dealing with this kind of subject. My first documentary was with the BBC. Then I did one for the ABC in the States. Discovery Channel was beginning to open up on these subjects. Ancient Aliens, started in 2008 or 9, I think, no?
Yes, almost 8, 9 years now. Yes,
but it certainly got a lot of the public attention. I have to admit, I kind of pulled out a bit, to be honest, because. Although I heard that it's kind of redressing its approach, but it got a bit silly at one stage. So
that's one way of putting it.
It really lost its. I mean, the subject is interesting, but sometimes there's only so many episodes you can really do on it, and they were really stretching it. I think. Yeah, they've taken it.
I think so.
The new episodes that are airing now, they have taken a much different approach, which is nice, but still. My ultimate favorite was the original Chariots of the Gods documentary based off Eric von Daniken's books. And, whether, despite what people might think of him, pro or con, it fascinated me as a kid and really started making me look at not the idea that everything was aliens. Giorgio, you got to love him, but everything's aliens. And I don't quite subscribe to that. Do I think they were involved to a certain extent? Possibly, but I also think our human civilization is much older and the history is much more wild than we really think in the general public.
Well, I should say, I mean, I have, I've met Eric von Daniken a long, long time ago. I'm trying to remember when it was. It must have been 1994. Sorry, 93. Just a few months before I published my first book, and like everybody in the 60s, I mean, I was fascinated and intrigued by the ancient alien idea. Daniken knows that I am very skeptical about how he approached the subject. We're very good friends. I meet him quite often at conferences, but there's a different way to look at this. And as you may or may not know, I've just completed a book with a astrobiologist Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe. We just co-authored a book called Cosmic Womb. It's at the editor at the moment. And there, as I would never have thought a few years ago that I would discuss this kind of subjects in a book, but he encouraged me to look at what I would call the new science. The idea being that I was very, very out of date with what was going on in the world of physics, in the world of cosmology, in the world of neuroscience. And I've known Professor Chandra for many, many years, and he kept saying, why don't we do a book together, you know? And so I said, I'm not quite sure about what, because he's the man, by the way, who, along with Sir Fred Hoyle, Andy should probably know this, in the 70s proposed the panspermia theory.
Oh, yes. I thought you knew the name as soon as you said it.
Yeah, Chandra Wickramasinghe and Sir Fred Hoyle, which is becoming quite popular now with most physicists and cosmologists. And so I wasn't quite sure what I could contribute to a book co-authored with him, but finally, and since we mentioned Eric von Däniken, this happened, let me remember, in 2015, I think it was April, it was Eric von Däniken's birthday, and he had a large party near Stuttgart. And Chandra and I met after many years that I hadn't seen him. And we talked again about this idea, but he said, listen, why don't you update yourself with what's going on in the astrobiological studies and in physics and cosmology as a, I was going to say the word amateur, I don't like the word, as an outsider. I mean, I obviously do not have the mathematical knowledge to check all these theories, but anybody can do this. I mean, there's plenty of material, good material you'll find on the internet, and some very good YouTube lectures by top cosmologists. I'm thinking of people like Brian Greene and Michio Kaku and a variety of these cutting-edge scientists. And well, I thought, okay, let me find out what's going on, you know. And of course, this was the year, it's been the year, by the way, of some major breakthroughs with the finding of exoplanets, with the expansion of the cosmological studies, with string theory and so forth, with breakthroughs in neuroscience and so forth. And I began to think, yeah, why was I so close to or poo-pooing this idea that there might have been an extraterrestrial contact? I mean, if serious scientists are open to the idea, let's be open. Let's see what there is to consider. So my approach, which is in a sense different, but perhaps less flamboyant than Eric von Däniken, is to say, look, to be honest, there is, I mean, as we stand now, sorry, you'll have to break in if you want me to.
No, we're enraptured, so please continue. We will have some questions, so go ahead.
All right, well, let me just condense this as much as I can. As we stand today, the honest position is that we have no evidence, none whatsoever, of life outside our own planet. That's where we stand. But
this is true.
Having said, yeah, I mean, it's a fact. But having said this, most cosmologists, most astrobiologists, most physicists are extremely open. In fact, the tables have turned. Now it is a kind of arrogance to say that there isn't life out there, even though we don't have the evidence. Because we're looking at a very different cosmos than we were hardly 20, 30 years ago. You know, the latest, for example, is suddenly, even though we had figures that were astounding, you know, 100 or 300 billion stars in our own galactic system, 200 billion galaxies out there, the latest from NASA is that, whoops, they made a mistake. Now that the Hubble telescope has been equipped with a much more sensitive camera. They're estimating something like 2 trillion galaxies. So with this enormity of mind-boggling cosmos out there, it would be bizarre that just one solar system has just one planet where life evolved. The other thing comes in the astrobiologists, who correctly argue that, we're made, literally, life is made from the most prolific elements that exist all over the cosmos: carbon, sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen.
It's like
It's all over the place.
Like Dr. Carl Sagan once said, we're made of star stuff. Everything that we are was made in stars. And if it can be made in our star or, stars around us, it has to happen all over.
At this stage comes in the argument of panspermia, because you rightly said that we're made of star stuff. And if stars have been manufacturing the heavy elements of which we're made, of all life is made, then there's no reason why other stars did not do the same thing and other planets got seeded.
Yes.
But panspermia brings something more exciting in this equation, is that, first of all, Chandra and Fred Hoyle believed, with many arguments, I don't want to go into science behind this, but they believed that life began outside our planetary system long before our solar system was created. So we're talking about the possibility of life elsewhere in the cosmos 10 billion years ago. There's no reason at all. We know that galaxy formed after a billion years or so after the Big Bang. So having said this, if panspermia is correct, and it seems likely that it is, then life was literally sent by exploding stars all over the place. Literally all over the place. Our galaxy must be teeming with life, let alone other galaxies out there. So we now also have cosmology to bring in the equation. Astrophysics has found other planetary system. I think the latest count is about 3,500 exoplanets. The most exciting one was TRAPPIST-1, what was it, a couple of months ago, where they found 7 Earth-like planets around a star that is only 49 light years away. The odds are extremely high of finding life within the next 20 years once we study more star systems in our galactic system.
Well, just to interrupt you for a second, I mean, let's face it, we may be finding life in our own solar system first. Not to mention, any type of life on Mars, but, NASA seems to be very excited about the possibility of life on Saturn's moons. You have Titan and Cephus. These moons with the water, frozen oceans, and life may be underneath. So not only finding life out there, but right in our own neighborhood too.
Correct. But here is the other question, of course, is if life began. Okay, let's take it from another point of view. We are a species, an evolved, intelligent, technological species that is barely 200,000 years old. Homo sapien, they've pushed it now to 300,000, but that's a fraction of the time of cosmological time. So here we are, we've taken it from stepping out of caves to having all the technology we have today, the wonderful Skype that we're talking on, the placing of satellites around our planet, exploring the moon, the man expeditions, and so forth. If we have been capable of evolving at that speed, can you imagine? And indeed, that's where it's interesting. We're predicting. When I say we, I mean scientists. I don't mean myself as part of them, but very serious scientists, Nobel Prize winners, are predicting amazing evolution in our technology. Computer technology is about to take a huge leap, moving into quantum computers within the next few years. Laser technology, digital technology, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, neuroscience. I mean, every day there is a breakthrough. We're moving at such exponential speed that within 20, 30 years, what we're considering still a bit science fiction will be very normal science. Can you imagine then in 100 years, or 1,000 years, or 1,000,000 years if we're still here? So the big question arises, what if there is an evolution that took place elsewhere that is ahead of us a few centuries or a few millennia, or even billions of years ahead of us? How we would recognize them? How will they see us if they've not already seen us? And how will communication take place? Well, we still think, because that's the technology we have today, that the only way at the moment is by radio communication. There is the SETI projects and various others. But futuristic ideas are that we will be able to communicate in a very different manner. The science theory is here. We simply don't have the technology yet. So looking at it this way, there is no reason at all why communication hasn't taken place by an advanced civilization, but at the wrong time. At the wrong time. That communication, say, took place. Can you imagine communication taking place hardly 300 years ago?
Exactly. And how would we recognize that? We're still sending out binary radio signals, which could be like sending smoke signals. We're so far behind, and the fact that
absolutely, and what you just said is brought another thought in my mind. Is the future of the human race, as we see it evolving with the technology that's going in parallel with neuroscience, with all the other cutting edge sciences, is that human beings in 100 years' time would seem so strange to us today. I mean, I was just watching a program the other day with implants of microchips.
Oh yes,
and
yes, yes.
And this is just the beginning. So robotic technology, neuroscience technology. So all this put in the basket of possibilities, we would today, and even today, we would have trouble recognizing a highly advanced signal, highly advanced message. In fact, they may have already contacted us, and we're being contacted without knowing. So having said this, we have to be open to the possibility of a contact in the past. We have to. As displeasing as it is to Egyptologists and archaeologists, that's my position. But we have to put on the table what is at least feasible from our point of view, from our science today. And it's the table is full of possibilities.
Well, even you mentioned it earlier, of these advanced entities, civilizations, if they came here even 100 years ago, not to mention thousands of years ago, how would they be reacted to? I mean, Robert Heinlein, the famous author, I'm going to paraphrase him here, is that any sufficiently advanced civilization technology could be looked at as magic or even religion. So our modern historians and archaeologists always seem to look at, like Egypt, the prime example. Oh, it's the gods, it's their religions. Not for 1 minute taking it seriously, like maybe this is real and what they're talking about. Even sure, there's a lot of cultural mythology put in with it, but it's talking about real events.
Correct. My take on all this is that contact, if contact has occurred, would not have been in a physical form. I don't visualize it like Daniken, that they came with flying ships and landed and and came up with all sorts of technology to build monuments and so forth. The contact will be non-physical, and that, by the way, is how we see contact. We are already. We're communicating by radio telescope. It's non-physical, but we speculate intelligently with theories that are floating around in cutting-edge science that will be able to download a human mind, place it on the laser beam, or better still, use quantum entanglement to communicate, to literally send instantaneously a human mind somewhere else in the cosmos. So these are possibilities. They seem far-fetched because, we honestly, we do not have the technology yet. One metaphor that I use in the book, which I like very much, is I'm very interested in the human brain these days. I've been reading a lot about neuroscience and its breakthroughs and but here it is. If we do have the science, we even have the technology, but if we were to duplicate an artificial human brain, it would today be the size of Manhattan, roughly. To power it, we would need a nuclear power plant. And to keep it cool, we'd probably need a river flowing through it. And I'm not just throwing figures. I mean, this has been calculated by various computer scientists today.
Yes.
To program it, we have no idea. We still haven't mapped the human brain and to see how the circuits would operate. But having said this, each one of us carry on our shoulders a brain that's about 1 kilo and 300 grams, the size of half a football, that 1 second of its operation, as I'm speaking to you now, would require several 100,000 of computers working in tandem to duplicate not just my thought processes, by all the activity that's going on in my body. And this thing works on 6 spoons of sugar a day. This is what we are. Now, once we understand how this thing works, I mean, as I'm speaking to you now, I'm only using, at best, 2% of its capacity. It's functioning at 100%, but I have no idea how it does it. I mean, simply blinking my eyelids requires, if I would have an artificial machine trying to do this, would require thousands, if not millions, of computer calculations. This thing does it just like that, instantaneously. Plus a zillion other activities going on, pumping the blood, keeping my body cool, instructing cells. I have no idea how it's doing it. I have no idea what the calculations are being done. I mean, think of a ballet dancer, or I was in Bulgaria recently and I was talking to a friend of mine who plays at the Sofia Philharmonic Orchestra. And I asked him, he's a clarinet player, and he's a soloist. He plays a whole symphony without looking at the music sheet. It's all coming out of his brain. And I asked him, how does he remember all this? How does he know which note to play? How does his brain instruct his hand and his fingers to push the keys at exactly the right? And he says, I don't know, I just do it. But what is going on there, we know, is zillions and trillions of calculations that is running the show. So once we're able to tap into this, once we're able to map this and see how it works, can you imagine the possibilities? Once we download it on a fast quantum computer, for example. However, here comes the big question. And this is the question that has to be asked. Can it be tapped naturally? Is it possible that ancient people found a way to tap into this?
I believe the answer is yes.
Well, possibly, but the other one, of course, is were they stimulated by some external source, by some ET source, to be able to tap this information, or the information put there, which we'll be able to do, by the way. In a few years' time, you'll be able to use a tiny microchip and learn Chinese in a matter of seconds. Download the whole Chinese language. So having looked at, yeah, sorry, I'm interrupting here.
No, you can't. Yeah, absolutely fascinated by what you're saying, certainly.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that it's time when I've woken up, okay, I've updated myself, I've taken the trouble to understand what's going on, and I've realized how close-minded I was, how obstinate I was not to be open to the possibility of either a ability to tap into the human brain naturally using, God knows, maybe meditation, maybe certain what we call rituals, I have no idea, or that there was an external stimulation coming from elsewhere. Having said this, we know that there are certain individuals who are able to tap. We have, I've been studying this as well. It's discussed in my forthcoming book. I've been studying the so-called super savants. These you in England, Andy, might have heard this. I mean, people like Daniel Tammet, for example. Yes?
Oh, yes.
No?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's frightening. Now, we think it's probably to do with autism, epilepsy that they suffered, caused the brain structure to transfigure itself in a different format. These individuals can work out extraordinary mathematical calculations instantaneously. They can factorize 6-digit numbers, for example, prime factorize. But when you ask them how they do it, they have no idea. They just say, my brain is doing it, and I just spurt it out. For example, Daniel Tammet sees it in colors. He sees 45,000 hues of colors, which each represent a prime number, and he can multiply. I mean, if you tell him 657 multiplied by 2038, bang, he gives you the answer. And he can prime factorize it backwards. So this is very impressive. That means he's able to tap. He doesn't know how he's doing it, but he's doing it. Suppose once we map the brain, we're able to do this, but let's suppose that there were people who were not just like Daniel Tammet, but who had found a technique to tap, or that they were encouraged by an outside force. This has to be on the table. We have to, because it exists.
So one of the things that I've been leaning more towards the theory is that we in the past were much more intelligent, had more access to this information, and for whatever reason, we, instead of evolving, we de-evolved. Whether it came around the time of what a lot of people refer to as the Great Flood, or some kind of cataclysm that reset civilization and people started over, and we seem to have lost a lot of those abilities that we used to have. And so now we're kind of rediscovering it, but from this new electronic age, which I'm still on the fence on, because let's face it, if you can make something electronic, somebody can hack it. somebody can use it for not the best purposes. So when you see these people getting microchipped these days, my first gut reaction is,
worrying, yes.
Oh, hell no. But, because there's such a possibility of misuse. But, maybe in the past, that's how they did it, or they had it, like you said, the natural way. I believe a lot of it, we had more natural abilities that we've got.
I don't think we've lost these abilities, honestly.
I simply think,
no, my take is that we're the same human beings. There's no reason why we're different. What is different is that we've externalized our search. In other words, we came equipped. We evolved. We're the product of 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, and at least 4 billion years on this planet, and 200,000 years of Homo sapien evolution. And we're equipped. We are well equipped. It's like the eagle flying and knows how. He doesn't know he's flying. He doesn't know how his brain is telling him, but he's equipped. We're equipped. And that is a strange term that appears frequently. And that's why the ancient Egyptians are very interesting on this point, because they keep insisting that some of their people were equipped. They were equipped to undertake what they saw as the main mission of their lives, was to somehow find a way to transmit themselves into other stellar systems. Now, I have to be a bit cautious here. I'm not saying they did it. All I'm saying is that they are suggesting something that is worth exploring, and here is really where we should be prompt to explore it, and we come now to the Great Pyramid. Because we're dealing with a monument that here we are in the 21st century, still unable to explain how it was built, when it was built, why it was built, and what's its function. We made some breakthroughs. We see that there was an astronomical, some sort of plan. They seem to be very keen on this stellar address. They went to a lot of trouble, if my theory is correct, which I believe it is, to indicate that whatever they were doing there, they somehow wanted to connect with a star system in the constellation of Orion. There's no doubt that that's what they wanted to do. The question is whether they did it. The other thing, of course, is the intriguing mathematics that comes out of the design of the Great Pyramid. Now, this has been flaunted and whipped, as we say in England, till the cows come home, and there's been a lot of nonsense said about this. But there is no doubt. I'm working with professional architects and mathematicians at the moment on this issue. There is no doubt that the geometry of the Great Pyramid produces a mathematics that is or should be alien to people 5,000 years ago. We're extracting mathematical constants that should not be there. We're even extracting geodetic values that should not be known to what Egyptologists say is a primitive group of people building a tomb. It's very difficult for me to go into the mathematics without a proper audiovisual presentation, but let me give you just a little bit. There is no doubt that the Great Pyramid is aligned with an incredible precision to the cardinal directions. The first question is, why would they want to do this? Because as an engineer, I can tell you, building a monument such as the pyramid is already an incredible engineering task. But if you want to keep it maintained with the precision that it has, it's the difference between a Rolex watch and a $10 watch made in China. There's a huge difference. They look the same, but the precision, to get the precision that is required, will demand a lot more work, a lot of high precision work. This is what you're looking at. You're looking at a high-tech monument, an archaic high-tech monument. And most annoying when you examine its geometry, because that's what it is. It is a stone monument aligned with precision to the cardinal direction, and it is representing a geometrical figure, a pyramid. But when you examine this geometry, its design, and more intriguing, its internal spatial design, you find that you're, again, whether by coincidence or not, you're extracting prime numbers. You're extracting certain constants. The phi, the pi, Euler's number, even the speed of light, for God's sake, appears in numerical form. You really have to ask the question, if it is what the Egyptologists say it is, then why the designer did it this way? We still can't explicate it. So science says we have an anomaly. There is an anomaly. It's the most promising anomaly that something happened that needs to be examined with all the possibilities open. We have to do it. And this is what I've been trying to do in the last couple of years. And this is why I'm producing this book, because it has to be done. Now, I'm not saying we found the answers. What we're doing is we're opening the question. And I brought in a heavyweight, like Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe. He's put his reputation on the line, writing a book with me. But
not at all.
Oh, yes, trust me. Egyptologists won't like it at all. But We're hoping that this will encourage scientists, cutting-edge physicists, even neuroscientists to look at this period and to look at this monument the way it should be examined. A lot of time has been wasted quibbling over theories and all sorts of nonsense. So this is the direction that I'm taking, and I firmly believe that whatever we'll find there will be either or. We're either going to find some bizarre mind, and we'll then have to explain how he got this information from, or we're going to find a possible non-physical extraterrestrial contact. I'm putting my reputation on the line here. It's going to be either this or that.
I like the notion of the non-physical contact. I mean, I know one of the things that I'm sure you're aware of as well is the fact that the frontal lobe in the humans grew rapidly, much bigger than it should be, and much faster than you'd expect evolutionarily to occur. So it does suggest something made that growth occur. So the idea of a non-physical extraterrestrial connection of some kind I find quite fascinating. I'm not a believer in the sort of nuts and bolts alien spaceships ever landing here. I know some people do, but personally, I'm more along the lines of what you're saying. That there's been a connection or interference, I suppose one way to put it, but certainly alterations, perhaps, whether it's done something deliberately or there's some kind of cosmic ray occurring, a natural phenomenon, but certainly some kind of external alteration to the brain functioning and growth. And as you were saying previously about the whole idea of the brain rewiring itself and working very differently, which you can see things like autism is part of that sort of spectrum, but also very unusual mathematical calculations, which you were speaking earlier, that kind of very strange abilities that some people seem to have to, say, for example, make those mathematical calculations in a fraction of a second almost in the brain, which for us normally would be virtually impossible, suggesting that the brain is capable of so much more and different ways of working that we haven't really tapped into. And kind of Mark was saying a little bit as well, the idea that perhaps in ancient past that may also have been the case, that we could brains worked differently, and we've effectively lost some of those abilities in the way that our minds are much more kind of narrow focuses in the modern mind now.
Yeah, I would put it slightly different. For one thing, I think we all have, our brain is functioning the same way, short of a damaged brain. But I'm talking about a healthy, normal human brain. There is no difference between you and me and Daniel Tammet. The only difference is that he's able to somehow tap into what the brain is doing. Our brain is doing it. We're all doing it, but we cannot tap. Having said this, what intrigues me most is that you're absolutely right. There's been a huge jump in evolution. We still haven't been able to explain this. We still haven't to explain why 200,000 years ago suddenly comes Homo sapien, and within 200,000 years we have the technology we have today. But the one that came very, very close to touching how it might have happened was Carl Sagan. I don't know if you remember his book Contact. I've reread it again. Now, we have to place ourselves in the context when he wrote it. When he wrote this book, what was it, in the 70s, early 70s, the cosmology hadn't evolved as much as we know today. We hadn't found yet exoplanets, for example. So he was rather cautious about how he approached it. But nonetheless, the neuroscience was still very early stages. People didn't talk too much about quantum mechanics. The string theories was a very early stage. So having got ourselves in the context when he wrote this book, he envisaged a radio contact. Yes, but I personally think that it would be a much more evolved radio technology would be dinosaur technology for us in a few decades, certainly within a century. So having said this, suppose, like in his book, a message is received, begin to understand it through understanding that the message is intelligent, prime numbers, and so forth, and that the idea is to tell this people that have been contacted, us in the past, okay, here is a machine, here is a design of a machine to be able to contact us in return. If you are as evolved as we are, here is the machine. Build it. But here's the problem. The technology doesn't exist.
Hmm.
There is no technology. There is no electronic technology. There is no metallurgy. There is no plastic. There is no science. Calculus has not been invented yet. But the design is there. The design is there. It's a bit like, let me give you a modern analogy. Boeing designs a new aircraft that will be built by Lockheed in America, which they do, by the way. All right? Mm-hmm. So they send them the full design, no problem. They have all the technology available to build it. But if they send this design to a tribe in the Brazilian jungle, they wouldn't know how to build this thing. They would. they just don't have the technology. They have the design, they don't have the technology. But somehow they're told that this is how to communicate with other star systems. So they do something. They build it, but they build it with the technology they have. I think we're looking at a blueprint. I think we're looking at the Great Pyramid. It is a blueprint. It's not a machine. I don't go for this machine idea. It is a design. And this design is telling us this is somehow related to the geodesy of our planetary system, and it's supposed to somehow communicate with the star system in the constellation of Orion. It's there, you know. They even put it in text. They think that this is it. Well, it's not going to work. It's not a machine that works, but it's a machine, it's a blueprint that we need to understand, because perhaps there is some sort of message that now that we have the technology, or may have the technology in a few decades, to be able to use it. So it's that exciting. I may be wrong, but that's how it seems to me. Believe me, I've been 30 years on these studies. And
so do you think it's possible then that if there is sort of a connection and they can observe that we have constructed it according to our understanding of the blueprints as an indication of our progress, perhaps?
Look, it's like giving a kid the design of a car, right?
Yeah.
And you know, and they're playing with Lego. I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a design, but it's not a machine. It is something that entered the brain of a designer, whoever he was, and said, "I'm supposed to build this, but all we have is stone, and it has to be that size. It has to be that shape. It has to have that eternal system," and they do it because when you look at it that way, and then they expect it to work. They even seem to try it. Now, that's after 30 years of looking at this monument from all angles, and now applying what I call the updated cutting-edge science to it, to be open to these possibilities. That's what it seems to me. That's what it seems to me. And even if it's a long shot, how incredibly arrogant people will look at us in 1,000 years saying, it was staring at you in the face, and you just did not look at it. You know, you just why? Because Egyptologists said it's a tomb, and we're all leaving it at that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have other forms of pyramids around the world as well that have a similar kind of design. Obviously, not as precise as the pyramids in Egypt, but that like an archetypal concept. This pyramid shape that you've seen built by other cultures as well. So maybe that sort of
we have large stones, we have pyramids, we have astronomy, and we have a total misunderstanding. I mean, we just cannot explain. But to me, the Great Pyramid is the centerpiece. It is the most promising artifacts we have on this planet that might be, just might be, some sort of design, some sort of blueprint left or passed on by an extraterrestrial communication. As speculative as this is, it is based on intelligent speculation on the knowledge we have today in science. And we have to consider it. That's it. I mean, I'm very, very adamant, but of course we need the means to do so, and that is again the problem with Egyptologists. So That's why I'm doing this book, because I'm hoping that with a heavyweight name like Chandra Wickramasinghe, it might break a bit of the resistance, and having people, serious heavyweights in mathematics, in science, in physics, looking at this again. There is an anomaly there. There is no question in my mind.
Sure. I'm wondering, actually, why do you think they stopped building them?
Well, the big question is, look, we're looking, I mean, even if we take the standard chronology, I mean, we know very, very little. Even if we take the standard chronology, we know very little about the Fourth Dynasty. Very little. I'm always intrigued when I pick Egyptological books, and some of them even tell you what King Khufu was thinking. We know nothing. We really don't.
Yeah.
There is no
contemporary
text, isn't it? Yeah, there is no contemporary texts. I mean, if anything, what should attract our attention is the anonymity of this monument. It's one thing that I'm always puzzled why Egyptologists are not puzzled. We know that there were that the ancient Egyptians, even of that period, were prolific in their writings. The tombs around the Great Pyramid, the mastabas of nobles and queens and princes are full of texts. And the pyramids that were built afterwards of the 5th and 6th and 7th dynasty are full of texts, but not the 4th dynasty and certainly not the Great Pyramid. Not one contemporary writing. I know there is this famous graffiti there, but I've just had a long talk with by the way, with Scott Crichton, the author of The Great Pyramid Hoax. At first I was very skeptical, but he convinced me. I had a long talk just before you came online. But anyway, having said this, we do not have any contemporary writing, nothing in this monument. It is totally anonymous, not even the name of the architects. Now, ask yourself this. Why would this monument be left totally anonymous when everything else in Egypt is full of text? I mean, you would have thought that if it was built as a tomb for this pharaoh, he would have bragged non-stop about it.
Absolutely.
Like all
I remember hearing you saying. Well, I remember hearing you saying yourself, are quite true. And if you write a book, he probably publishes a book for you, but leaves your name off the book. It's rather insulting, really. So, yeah.
Ah, you heard me say this. Yeah, well, there you go.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Well, you know, these pharaohs are supposed to be egocentric. They're supposed to be megalomaniacs. They mobilized, according to Egyptologists, the whole of their nation to build those pyramids. I mean, and boy, we know of Ramses, all the Ramses dynasty, the New Kingdom dynasties. I mean, these guys bragged all the time, you know, with their statuaries and monuments and texts and stories about their conquest and so forth. This nothing, zilch, not one word.
But could it be? Here's a question for you. Then I know there's a lot of theory being presented now that the reason it isn't a monument, I don't believe it's a monument. There's a theory that it's really a machine, that it's some type of power plant or power generation plant. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
My answer is no.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want to appear poo-pooing fellow authors, but this is not it. This is not it. I've lived there. You know, many of these books are written with people who go there for a week, for 2 weeks, or a few days. And when you look at this monument, as I have, I mean, I grew up in Egypt till I was 20. I spent 3 years outside the Great Pyramid. I had an apartment which I could almost touch the Great Pyramid. This is not a machine. Not a practical, functioning, mechanical machine. It isn't. It is a metaphysical idea. It's a three-dimensional map, all right? It's a three-dimensional blueprint. That's how it looks like, with a function. But the function that they tell us is to communicate and transmit a human mind or a human soul or whatever you want to call it to a star system. We know this. They left us texts. All right, it's fact. I mean, I'm not saying things that is speculation. The monument is anonymous. It's a geometrical design. You extract mathematical constants and high mathematics, by the way, prime numbers. I mean, a whole host of them. I mean, I didn't know this, to be honest with you. I mean, I only started this 2 years ago, having been prompted by 2 or 3 architects, including my brother, by the way, who was a very well-seasoned architect. But they finally convinced me and say, look, I mean, have a look at this. And I did, you know, cautiously and calmly. And we're not talking speculation. This monument, its geometry extracts mathematics that is suggestive of some sort of mathematical message. Its astronomy does the same thing. That's exactly how we would send a message outside our solar system. We would have astronomical coordinates and we'll have a mathematical message. We'll be speaking mathematics. So this monument does this, and it's anonymous, and it's got a design that nobody can explain. It begs to be investigated this way. It's been begging for the last 4,000 years. The trouble is that it fell into the hands of humanists who are convinced, archaeologists who are convinced that somehow it served as a tomb. There's nothing more absurd than a monument or a structure that is serving as a tomb. We know that pharaohs, certainly of later dynasties, did exactly the opposite. They wanted to hide themselves, not expose themselves. You could see them. The Great Pyramid can be seen from 25 miles away. If it is a tomb, then they certainly did a very bad job of hiding it.
Very true. I'd say it kind of reminds me of the TV show we used to have over here, which did live archaeology, and I've completely forgotten the name of the show. I do apologise, but one of the things they used to say about it was Time Team. The show was whenever they found anything they couldn't quite explain, it was always described as being a religious artifact or a ceremonial artifact. When they said actually we don't really know what it's for, so the idea of it being a tomb because we don't know what it's really for, that kind of falls into that same kind of area with Egyptologists, I think.
Look, if the Great Pyramid had texts like we saw, even then I would be very, and it didn't have a geometry. It just was big, all right? A big monument, big monument, but it didn't have the astronomical and geometrical qualities that it have. I would have said, okay, well, yeah, it's a crazy thing to do, but they were megalomaniacs and they wanted to build a tomb. But it doesn't do this. This monument is built with the intention to have it very, very, very precisely set. It has proportions that invite you to consider the geometry of the planet. It does. You know, it's a fact. Yeah, I mean, let's bottom line this thing. The Great Pyramid is an anonymous monument that produces a geometry. Maybe I should make it a bit more precise. It's not difficult to design an external shaped pyramid. Any kid can do this, no problem. You know, it's a very easy shape to design. But the Great Pyramid, as well known, even Egyptologists know this, is not a perfect square-based pyramid. It has a slight concavity at the center of each side. This concavity, and it is not what Egyptologists say, it isn't a damage, it isn't rain falling. Architects have well examined this, and we're all convinced that it is a designed element in the pyramid. Once you put a concavity like that in such a design, the design becomes extremely complex externally. And what it produces a topless pyramid, a pyramid with a truncated top. The geometry forces this issue. Here is the weird thing. Since the time of Napoleon, when they examined this monument, many have found in the units of measurement, we know that that the pyramid is designed using a unit we call the royal cubit. But this royal cubit, strangely enough, has a relationship with the modern meter. It sounds historically impossible, but it does. It's a fact. It's a mathematical fact. Whether it's a coincidence is another questionable issue, but it is a mathematical fact that if you take a circle with a diameter of 1 unit, and you divide that circle by 6, the circumference of the circle by 6, you get the royal cubit. It's too much of a coincidence. So if you give that circle a unit of 1 meter, the division of the circumference, 1/6 of it, produces exactly to 4 decimal places the royal cubit. Now, why a circle? Because the pyramid base is designed such that if you consider its height in relation to its perimeter base, you're considering the same thing as a radius to a circle. It's inviting us to consider this. But where is the meter? Where is the meter? We have a 1 unit possibility of a circle, but we don't have the meter yet. Well, lo and behold, architects are beginning to find a meter equivalent. And the one that appears most, get ready for this, is the so-called truncated top. The first thing you ask yourself of this pyramid when you see it, I remember taking tours there, is people look at it and say, oh, the top is missing. It's the first thing you say. It's forcing people to say, where is the top? Right? There's no top. Well, it didn't have a top. It has a virtual space. It's forcing you to imagine a space. When you imagine the space, and when you design it properly, based on the geometrical design of this monument, when you actually design this virtual space at the top, you find that you can fit in there a globe or a circle that has precisely, within 4 decimal points, a meter in length, the modern meter. It is historically impossible. Forget it. Well, no, it is not impossible if you know the diameter of our planet, because that's how the French found it in 1793, which means, if this is correct, it means that whoever designed this monument knew the dimension of the planet. One of those things. You cannot ignore it. You can say it's coincidence, but then we're finding one after the other, coincidence on top of coincidence. So, conclusion is, as difficult as it is to digest, a bit like quantum mechanics, we have to accept the reality that this monument, whoever designed it, knew the dimension of the planet. And then you take it further and you find crazy things like he seemed to have known, as nutty as it seems, the speed of light in a vacuum. You get the numerical value up to 6, 7 decimal points.
Good Lord.
These are facts. The question is whether we're dealing with coincidence. And the trouble is, somewhere along the line, when you top coincidence on top of coincidence, at what stage do you stop saying coincidence?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know? Well, I've reached a stage where I'm forced, whether I like it or not. And believe me, I know the problem, because when I said 3 stars look like 3 pyramids on the ground, hell broke loose. I mean, they thought that this was very controversial. Well, it's nothing compared to what we're suggesting now, but we are forced to put it on the table. We are forced to say, look, there's too many coincidences for it to be coincidence. So what do? We say, no, let's brush it under the carpet and forget it and get on with our lives? Or do we take it in the direction that science should take it, that they examine an anomaly, however controversial it might seem? We would not be on the moon. Sorry?
No, I say this is specific to those 3 pyramids. I know obviously there are other pyramids in Egypt, but these dimensions you're talking about are specific to those pyramids.
Absolutely. No. It's a very early stage. I mean, we're finding dimensions in other. 4th dynasty is the one. The big question that has to be asked is, you're looking at a stage where before it seems to be very, very early architecture. Suddenly it shoots up in the 4th dynasty to the pyramids you have there, the Dashur pyramids, the Giza pyramids, and then it drops. There's no doubt something happened. Something happened to push the technology to that level and push the geometrical designs to that level. So we need to explain this, and we need to explain these bizarre anomalies, how somehow the meter unit finds itself in the design of this monument.
Absolutely.
And other things.
When's your book out? Because I want to read this. When's it out? Do you know?
It's out, well, if the publisher is on track, it should be out in early December. It's actually at the final stage of editing. Let me explain how this book is done, and perhaps we can close it here. I could not have possibly integrated myself in writing a book with Professor Chandra Bikramasinghe. His experience is totally different from mine. He is a scientist of high caliber, and there's no way we can write a book together. The way we've done it is to split the book in 2 parts. He writes the first part to tell us why What I will suggest in part 2 is on the table today. Based on panspermia, based on cutting-edge science, based on 60 years of teaching astrobiology, astrophysics, cosmology, all these cutting-edge subjects that are required to understand the possibility of life outside our solar system. So he puts it online there, and he's very, very open to the possibilities of an extraterrestrial contact. Having done this, I go to the pyramid, part 2. And I've devoted 3 chapters for the benefit of readers who would be like me, saying, look, before we even talk about the pyramid, which happens in chapter 4, before we do that, let's update ourselves. Let's see what's going on in the world of science today. Because if you move straight into chapter 4, either you will say, well, no, this is too science fiction and whatever, or you will be like the Egyptologists saying, no, it's not possible. Let's see what is on the table. And that's what I do. I go very carefully into quantum mechanics, into all the subjects that are required to arm yourself intellectually, then to look at this monument properly. So that's how it should be done. And we did it. I hope we did it. I mean, I spent 2 years. It's been edited 4 times to make sure that it reads properly. And that's the idea. And you're left with an open question. Having gone through this exercise, having carefully examined everything that needs to be examined without overkilling, then I think most people will say yes. We do have something that is the nearest thing to a possible contact. It's smelling this way. It looks like a duck, it smells like a duck, it walks like a duck, as we say. It's probably a duck. And let's somehow get the right people to open up an investigation. There is at the moment, but they're still following Egyptological and archaeological rules. There's been the muon scanning tests and the infrared scanning tests, but they're under the ages, if you like, of Egyptologists who tell them, look for a tomb, look for a chamber. No, we need to see if there's something in these anomalies of design. We need somebody who understands this high mathematics, but go in there because it needs to be properly examined. There is things in this monument that even the top engineers, and believe me, I've talked to them. I happen to be, most of them have passed away. I'm of the older generation. By the way, I'm 70 years old, so in case you're wondering. So I come from the generation of Sir Ivan Edwards, of Jean Carissel, of Jean-Philippe Loher, all these big names in Egyptology. Jean Carissel, who was a very, very good friend of mine, was the top engineer in France. And you have to listen to these people. These are the people to listen to, not Zahi Hawass and others. That they know their topic. And he was saying to me, look, we can't explain it. We can't explain how they move 60-ton blocks into a height of 50 meters and place them with that kind of precision. We can't. So there is the technological issue that needs to be understood, but then the big issue as to why they did this. Why cart blocks that weigh 70 tons? Look, guys, I can go on forever. We're going to run out of time.
Yeah.
It's 6 o'clock.
Well, Robert, we'll go ahead and we'll end it there. But fascinating subject, and you really brought up some excellent points that I haven't really thought about before. And definitely are looking forward to your new book. Is that going to be published through Inner Traditions?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Very familiar with them. I have a relationship with them.
Yes, I have a very good relationship with Inner Tradition, and I have a very good editor working on this book. This book has been also edited again by a mathematician. We needed somebody to also very carefully look at the figures and all that. We try to make it as friendly, usable as possible. We don't want to blow people's mind with science. I mean, it's written in a very friendly way. The whole idea is to say, guys, it's no more taboo to consider this monument as a possible evidence of some sort of extraterrestrial contact. It's no more taboo. It's no more, we shouldn't be refraining ourselves from it because there is Egyptologists who will poo-poo it and so forth. Because that's what scientists who put their nose into this believe, that it should be on the table. Well, there you are. I enjoyed it. Let me know when you have it on the air.
Sure. Well, Robert, let me ask, if you could tell people your website, where they can get in touch with you, see more of your work, and your books are all available on Amazon and other places, and on your website. Well, what's the website address?
The website is www.robertbauval.co.uk.
.uk.
And please do not do .com, because you're going to get, I think it's off now, but it was a pornographic site for some reason.
I love when they do that.
Oh, yeah. And believe me, I spent years trying to get it off the air. For some reason, they wouldn't.
Oh, God.
I think it's gone now.
Oh, good. All right, Robert,
yes.
well, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night now. Bye-bye. Well, that was a very, very interesting discussion. I've always wanted to speak with Robert Bauval. I've always been fascinated. As I mentioned off air, he has one of those voices that when he lectures or he talks, you just get enthralled. He has that one of those voices that you can just get mesmerized by and listen to all day. So always really fascinated with his topic, and I was not previously aware that he was one of the first people to come up with the whole realization of how the pyramids aligned with the Orion belt of Orion. Something we didn't get to ask him is, I know he was also looking into partly of archaeoastronomy, in the fact that the Egyptian pyramids and things, while they're lining up pretty accurately, aren't perfect, but that's because they are lined up with the way the stars were thousands of years ago. In fact, that's where some people are starting to realize now that the pyramids themselves and the Sphinx and some of the other older constructions are much, much older than what we think. What is modern archaeology puts them at 4,000 years old, when in fact there's now evidence to show that they're anywhere from 10 to 12,000 years old.
Yes, I know specifically with the Sphinx, that really does seem to be the theorizing at the moment, that so much of it is still buried deep in the sand that, again, we can talk about the idea of there being chambers beneath the Sphinx, but the Sphinx itself, certainly, if any area is older than thought of, is going to be the Sphinx. But the pyramids too these questions are certainly being raised. I know some of the criticisms that have been raised is the question of the dating of alignment, because of course now it would be slightly off, but we're talking about sort of thousands of years ago, and if you adjust it to the time scale that they're talking about, then it does work. But if you adjust it to the time scale of, shall we say, standard Egyptology, it doesn't work. So that's the conflict here, I think, at the moment, in terms of if it is of a certain age, the age works for one version of the theory but doesn't work for the other. But if the first version is correct and the second version, i.e. the newer, which is the standard version, if that's wrong, then they're going to have to rewrite the history when it comes to ancient Egypt. And there is always massive resistance in academia for any kind of dramatic change in theory. They will always resist it beyond belief. An old friend of mine from years ago, his degree is actually in Egyptology now, and I haven't seen him for a long time, I have to say, but when he was doing his degree, he said that the amount of controversy and conflict that goes on in this field, because people build a whole reputation on a particular theory and argument, and they will argue the damnedest if there's any kind of evidence against it. They will fight tooth and nail. They won't sit back and say, okay, maybe I got it wrong, because they see it as being their entire career is now thrown out the window. So there is always massive resistance. And something I wanted to ask Robert about was, what resistance have you experienced? Because I know there have been areas we could have explored there, but he had so much to say. There was so much useful and important information that it was hard to really kind of stop him and just let that flow going. As you say, he's a brilliant speaker. I just say I've watched a few. I think I mentioned the show. I've watched him on YouTube a few times, and he has got that very engaging way of talking. As you said yourself, you can listen to it because it's delivered so well. It's lots of information, complex, but it flows really well. And as we were finding, it's just you don't want to interrupt him because it's just got that great flow to what he was saying.
it's the great flow, and it's the information that's being presented is just, it's really fascinating. And you mentioned a great point. The point is that modern archaeologists spend their careers and reputations building theories, and it's almost, this is where I liken historians and archaeologists to almost having their own religion. It becomes a dogma, and if you start to present evidence that threatens that dogma, they're going to fight you tooth and nail, because that's their bread and butter. And this is, some of the other stuff that he was talking about in the advancement of human beings and technology. We always used to talk, look at even science fiction, 100 years ago or early 20th century. People dreamed of these utopias where machines would do all of our work for us, and we would just, we would have time for art and leisure and all that. And now we have it, and what do we have? Insane poverty, people out of work, and mass corruption. And these theories, and this is why I'm personally against the idea of microchipping, or even the thought of transhumanism, incorporating machinery into biologics to create an advanced life form. Well, I'm not against it for religious reasons. I'm against it for practical reasons, that human beings, I'm sorry, they can't be trusted. People do all sorts of things for power, control, money, and you want a company microchipping you, watching your every single move, and then what happens when they fire you? Are they going to take their property back? Or
exactly.
The government.
So I think that
Yeah, you think of the government microchipping you. Okay, they're already spying on us in every damn way they can, interfering in our lives and micromanaging us, and then we want to give over to high technology to let to advance ourselves that can be hacked and controlled. No. Again, it's not because I have a fear of advancement. I have a fear of, I don't trust other people, and people have different motives. So that's where we get in with that whole talk. But let's get back to Egypt, because where I'm really fascinated with a lot of what he's brought up, there are other people that I've been following for a while. Robert Forster is one. We've had him on the show a while back.
Yes.
Are you familiar with him?
Not incredibly, I must admit.
If you look at his YouTube channels, he lives in Peru, but he travels the world. I'd like to know where he gets his funding, because I'm jealous. He travels the world, going to these megalithic sites. He's been to ancient Egypt many times, but there are correlations in Peru and Mexico, and we'll get into those. But the pyramid, and this is a question I did not get to ask Robert, is, we talk about the mathematical properties of the pyramid are so insanely advanced, and we barely got to scratch the surface of not only the design was so advanced, but how did they build the damn thing? With there's always the Hollywood vision of slaves pulling big blocks on rollers. Of course, only trees they had out there were date palms, which are a soft, mushy wood and would never work. They didn't have pine forest trees for logs, and even then those logs would be crushed by the weight of some of those stones. And how did they make this? Now, Brian Forrester's research, he does a lot. What I like about him, he's very down to earth. He doesn't talk. He's been on Ancient Aliens a lot too, but he doesn't talk about aliens. He talks about ancient machining, ancient millwork machining on these stones, going and looking at how they were perfectly cut, put together without mortar, and shaped and moved and transported, and not only transported hundreds of miles from the Aswan quarry, but also to raising them up hundreds of feet. and getting it in position. Do you remember the old, there used to be a theory, well, they built these large ramps to bring them up.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, what did they do with all of that dirt when it was gone? Things they don't quite think about.
It's often that's the thing. You look at these things, and you think, "Oh, that's nice, big pyramid. I wonder, how do they do that?" And then you sort of forget about it. But as you say, how do they do these things? It does leave you absolutely mind boggled. It's I've just managed to call up some information on Brian for us, and yes, I mean he's talking about the construction systems. It is incredible.
And the cutting of the blocks, the machinery itself, how they cut these blocks and transported them. And now we're going to talk about a difference here. There's the pyramids, and then there are the other structures that came later. And this is what's odd is the pyramids, and especially the Sphinx, are so old. The Sphinx, and one of the things that Brian Forrester points out is the Sphinx, the body of the Sphinx shows severe water erosion. Water, as in rainfall, which they have not had that type of rainfall in the Giza Plateau for tens of thousands of years. Now, the Giza Plateau and the Sahara Desert, which adjacents it, used to be a lush, fertile area. It was very green. And with climate change, which is a natural part of the Earth, people, with climate change, it turned into the vast desert that it is. It became arid, less rainfall, and yet on the Sphinx, you see all the erosion around the body that was worn down, and it had to have been not only at a time when the Sphinx was exposed to more rainfall than it gets today, but the amount of erosion that's coming down over the body means it had to have happened over a long period of time. Which goes to show that, and I believe that the Sphinx is way older than they propose. Even the head of the Sphinx, which has been recarved, because the head, first of all, is much newer, cleaner looking. It's smaller. It's out of proportion for the body. And I think what happened is one of the later Egyptian pharaohs who decided to recarve it, to glorify his own ego. And so there's been a lot of speculation. Was it a head of a lion? I saw some interesting theory that perhaps it was really a head of a jackal. It's hard to say.
Have you actually been there, Mark?
I've never been there. God, I want to go so bad.
I have. I was there in 2004. And yes,
lucky bastard.
The thing you are struck by is the disproportion between the body and the head. You do notice, it's very noticeable. Also, the fact that there is obviously a lot more detail in the head than there is in the rest of the body. Any photograph you look at, it doesn't look quite right. But when you're actually walking around it, it definitely doesn't seem right. It does feel there's an addition that's been added on later on, certainly. So, yeah, I mean, I know most of the body was buried, obviously, for a very long time in the sand, and to some degree that would have preserved it or could also eroded it, because depending on weather forecast, of course, winds blowing sand across the stone monument. But you are struck by the fact that the proportions just don't seem right at all.
Well, and then there's, if you see aerial photographs, anything taken from above, or even on Google Earth, if you go down and look at it, you see this big, long body with this tiny little head on top. It doesn't look right. And here's something else to consider. With the three pyramids, in fact, all of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, and, those are the most famous, the three pyramids. Of course, there's a bunch of smaller pyramids nearby, and Egypt has dozens and dozens of pyramids. They're all over the place. But, they're in such a state of decay, and a lot of the pyramids were pillaged for materials. A lot of the limestone that used to cover the pyramids, they used to be covered. They used to be smooth with a limestone coating, and a lot of that was taken off. And I don't know if it's the Great Pyramid or Khufu's Pyramid, where you could see where some of it is still up at the top.
Yes, the middle of the three, you can just certainly make out there was something additional there. But as you say, they were completely covered at one point. You can imagine that white glowing. It would be an incredible sight.
And here's the thing is, with all of that material gone, it's impossible now to date the pyramid, because if the original cap covering was in place, we could tell the weathering and if it experienced the same type of rainfall and weathering as the Sphinx. But because they ripped it, they over the centuries they cannibalized the pyramids for local buildings. It helped to build Cairo and other areas. We just simply don't know because that evidence has been destroyed. Now, when he mentioned that there are slight concaves on each side of the pyramids, again, that's another one. If you look at aerial photographs or even from space or on Google Earth, you can see exactly what he's talking about. In the center of each flat side, it is concave, and you see a line running down. So instead of a four-sided pyramid, it almost looks like it's an eight-sided pyramid.
Yeah.
Now, they talk about the one thing that he mentioned I'm not so sure on the top of the Great Pyramid is they have the metal tower structure to try to show how tall they think the pyramid was. Now, if you listen to like the writings of Edgar Cayce, the great American mystic, he tried proposing that there was a crystal capstone on top of that, which has, of course, vanished. Now, Robert Bauval saying that there was no capstone, it just naturally rounded out at the top rather than come up to a spike. Interesting theory. I'm really not sure.
Yes, I like that, the notion there of that open space at the top, like a kind of, as you say, almost like a vanishing point, and there will be almost like imagine it's there. It's kind of like a point of focus, if you like. I mean, I kind of think the way exactly you phrased it in the interview, but it was that kind of thing. Because you do notice, again, sorry to show off, Mark, but I haven't seen them for real. It do look as if they've been pushed down and they're bulging slightly. I know one thing I read a long time ago is that could be the cumulative amount of the weight of the stone that's gradually pushing down, and so the middle part is bowing out a little bit, which you get in some cathedrals over here, where the sheer weight of stone above has meant the lower parts have begun to expand outwards slightly. But that didn't seem right to me. That's even an odd explanation. But the fact that they don't quite follow the line of sight that you'd imagine of being a pure triangular pyramid is itself, it draws you to look almost above the central point. So the Casey idea of that crystal being at the top, whilst I must admit I agree with Robert, probably isn't the case, but you can see where that idea is coming from, certainly.
You had asked a question earlier of him, and he didn't really answer it, about the fact like, well, why didn't they build any more? Well, they
noticed that, did you?
Yeah, they and they built, like I said, there are dozens of pyramids all over Egypt, and of course, as we've seen, all over the world, but nothing to that majesty. And I think, again, this is my personal opinion, only based on a lot of the research I've done, and this is something Brian Forrester has mentioned in his work, is that we had more advanced knowledge farther back in time than we did as time progressed. This goes back to this whole thing of we're a species with amnesia. We don't know our own history. And I firmly believe that we had very advanced civilizations on this planet going farther back in time, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even longer, that for whatever reason we had whatever catastrophe that, people talk about the Great Flood myth that most cultures have. Some people theorize there was a solar system wide catastrophe. Maybe that's along the time where Mars was killed. But for whatever reason, we forgot. We didn't learn, or we forgot what we knew. So I think those pyramids were built pre-Egyptian, just like the Sphinx. Pre-Egyptian civilization, and whatever happened, that civilization fell, and then the other civilization comes up and rises up, and they make these smaller pyramids that are cruder, that are rounded, that don't seem to fit right because they were trying to emulate what was made before. But notice how tiny they were. They couldn't even come.
That was exactly the point I was going to try and make afterwards, after I asked the question, was, is it because these are so much older, and the pyramids we've seen afterwards were there attempts to reconstruct, or copy that design without really knowing what they were doing, because the knowledge itself had been lost of how they'd done those. That's why there are many of those kind of stepped pyramids you get in Egypt as well, and a lot of them have been completely eroded away. But these guys, these three monsters, or the two monsters and the slightly smaller one, have survived that time, even with their, as you say, outer coating removed. But that was my thinking. Is it that what we were seeing was them attempting to replicate those pyramids, and then realizing, hey, we can't do this, guys. Let's have the Valley of the Kings instead. That kind of shift of idea.
Right, and the fact that they call it a tomb, which is total horse bucky. They, he made a good point that there are no hieroglyphics whatsoever inside the pyramids, the big pyramids. And, I'm actually surprised that later dynasties didn't come in and add it, to kind of take it over, usurp it for their own egos. That always does.
Well, again, you could possibly question perhaps they were so much in awe and perhaps a little afraid of these strange buildings out in the desert that they thought, I'd rather not go near those, because they're quite suspicious people anyway. They think, no, I don't want to touch that, and sort of kind of just leave it as in this strange monument in the desert.
Well, you know what's funny is you look at, there seem to be, and not just in Egypt, but in other places, and I'll give some examples. It seemed to be where we once had all of this knowledge, but we didn't lose it all at once. It trickled away, like you punch a hole in the bottom of a cup full of water and it drains out till finally it's all gone. And I feel that's what happened not only with the Egyptian civilization, but a lot of the civilizations down in South America and elsewhere, where they built these structures, and then over time they started to lose the knowledge until it was gone, because they were still building phenomenal structures cut out of stone. The statue of Ramses itself, even though now it's laying in rubble, was one of the largest stone statues in the world. The obelisks, how the hell they moved these single blocks of granite. So they were still doing some phenomenal engineering to move and cut, shape these blocks, position them perfectly, yet they still were not on the grandeur of the Great Pyramid. And over time, it started fading away, and then building structures got cruder and cruder. I'm going to point to down in South America. In Bolivia, there is the structure of the complex of Pumapunku.
Yes.
Which is one of the, to me, is the most fascinating complex I've ever seen. It even rivals the Great Pyramid, only because these blocks that were cut, and again, I point people to Robert Forrester's YouTube channel. If you get a chance, go see what he puts out there. It's very down-to-earth, scientific, and he shows how not only were these blocks so perfectly fashioned, where he's using an angle to show how sharp and perfect the sides are and the corners are, the intricate cutting inside, even the holes that look like drill holes, or you can see they found evidence of ancient machining, of saws that would cut this stuff, but it's laser precision.
Yeah.
Like these were made out of a mold, or like nowadays where now the big thing is to, what do they call it? 3D printing. It's like these blocks were made out of 3D printing, and so perfectly aligned. Now, there's the nearby complex of Tiwanaku, just about a quarter of a mile away. And while there's some impressive stonework there, it's nowhere near as impressive as Pumapunku. Now, they have these big blocks that they carve and shape and fit together without mortar. And the ones at the bottom, which are the oldest, the largest stones, are more impressive. But then over the centuries, the Inca came in, built on top of it, and the rocks are put together. They're smaller, cruder, put together with mortar. And even then, there's even older on top that's even cruder. So instead of evolving in techniques, they de-evolved. They lost knowledge over time. And I think that's true also of what happened with the Egyptians. These pyramids, for whatever reason they were built, I lean towards the fact that they were a machine of some kind. Maybe not a power plant. He mentioned a very interesting idea about projecting consciousness to other star systems.
That I found particularly fascinating, yes.
Well, now they have discovered that the acoustics inside the king's chamber they're incredible. You play different sounds, or even if you chant at certain frequencies, it resonates in such a way that people just feel the energy flow through them. And there's a lot of evidence coming out now that the ancient Egyptians used sound and acoustics as their technology.
I've heard that as well. Yeah, that's something I've come across as well. This whole notion that somehow the sound waves themselves could even cause objects to levitate. Again, there's no scientific research that suggests that can work, but the idea itself is very intriguing, because we've all seen what sound and heavy sound waves can actually do. It can crack stone. We know that, but it's modern technology has been the stuff that's been used to make that effect. It is very difficult to achieve. So that kind of time frame, you'd have to ask, how on earth could they generate that kind of sound wave with force and intensity to have those kinds of effects? So that is a fascinating area as well, certainly. But you do notice that with the pyramids, I mean, unfortunately, to get inside, you had to get there very early, and it was a very long queue and quite expensive, and get through a door that I personally might have struggled to fit through because it was quite small. But they do talk about the fact there are various chambers that are like tunnels that go out to the surface of the pyramid, the outer surface, and there was just no explanation for why they're there. No one seems to know at all. And I know Robert mentioned in an interview he did a while ago about one particular one that's sealed off by a door, that there seems to be a lot of resistance about having this particular door opened to find out what's behind it, as if there's something that's kind of almost conspiratorial in terms of let's keep this information quiet. And there is certainly, when you read around, you get that feeling that there is more known than they're prepared to necessarily tell us publicly. Not talking about grand conspiracies here, but people are trying again sort of protect reputation, and rather than allowing sort of truth and proper investigations to be carried out.
I believe there is a kind of conspiracy. It's a conspiracy based out of fear. Fear and knowledge is power. And if you hold on to the knowledge, you have power. But if you're proven wrong, you lose your power. Let's face it, the Catholic Church did that for centuries. When the Bible wasn't translated into readable languages in English and other languages until just a few hundred years ago. You had to go to the priests for the knowledge, which was jealously guarded and hand-doled out to people. I think the same is true of archaeology today, and historians. I even remember, being in school in the 70s and being taught certain things, and now what we're being taught, some of it is being thrown out the window by new discoveries, and yet they still jealously guard it. They don't want to change. There's such a resistance to change, and people who bring new ideas and theories risk losing their careers and getting laughed out by their peers, like putting ideas through peer review. Well, peer review doesn't mean that, they're going to look at it and look at your theories and agree with you. If it's a threat to their own theories, they're going to rip you to pieces, and then you lose your career. So I've heard many different archaeologists over the years who talked about that they stayed in the closet. They couldn't, for fear of being blackballed from the community for speaking, about some of their discoveries.
The other thing, of course, which you can never rule out with this kind of area, is not just the power of it, it's the funding. So much that relies on government funding or a private company funding you. And, of course, if people come across with new theories that invalidate your own, you're liable to lose your funding. And, of course, that really hurts. That's the biggest stumbling block. I mean, again, go back to my friend who did do Egyptology as his degree. That was one of the things that is a problem. And more generally in science, it's not so much the search for truth as a search for funding. And if you can do something that maintains the fees are flowing in, then great. And as soon as things come along that suggest perhaps there's a problem with what you're saying, the money just stops, and then your career just stops. So that, again, that's another big feature. So you've got these old, let's use the
term, some dinosaurs in this field, that will stand rigidly behind the theories that they've supported for 30, 40 years because they don't want to lose that position at the university, that professorship, the lecturing, that kind of thing will disappear if it's proven absolutely that there are errors. So they'll hold on to that. So that definitely plays a big part of this as well, certainly.
And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. The idea of these utopian societies falls apart when you bring in modern economics. And, people need money to buy food and do things and survive. And if you don't have a job that's going to pay you the money, and let's face it, these historians, these archaeologists, they get paid through the funding. And if you lose your funding, you're on the street. So people do things
absolutely.
They stay with the status quo. And it's really difficult for us to advance as a society. The only area we seem to be really advancing in is technology. But even technology, as much as we've advanced these last few years, there is still issues on how it's being used. A lot of it is being weaponized. A lot of it is being used against the people in terms of, the spying on people through your goddamn microwave. I mean, come on. Us talking here on the computer, my camera light is not lit up, but, they're probably watching what we're doing right now. Just
well, the camera on my laptop has got blue tack over the front of it, so you can't see it anyway.
Yeah, I need to get the little piece of tape over, but that doesn't keep them from listening in. And
no.
Technology can be abused, and that's why I'm just so against this whole transhumanism thing. And let's also face it too, humans make mistakes. Humans are also our society, especially these days, is insanely short-sighted. We look to the next fiscal quarter. Instead of looking like 10, 20, 50 years down the road, we only look a couple of months ahead in what we're doing, and people look at trends in technology, and it's so short-sighted that, look, even in the medical industry where they try to test drugs and whatever, or procedures, they don't look at the long-term effects. They see what's short-term effects. People getting bariatric surgery to lose, who are morbidly obese and lose hundreds of pounds. And now it's coming out that those people are dying. My aunt had it done, and she died because of complications of this surgery, because nobody looked to see what the long-term ramifications were going to be. So that's where we as a society, I'm very skeptical about the motivations for things. We are intelligent enough as a species that we can do some wonderful things if we put our mind to it. But we have to overcome our liabilities, which is greed, lust for power, and selfishness. Those are very difficult obstacles to overcome if we really are going to advance as a species. And right now, to me, while we may be technologically advancing as a civilization, we're devolving. We are stepping way back in terms of the average person advancement and where they step, where they are on an intelligence level, knowledge level. People are just stupid these days.
I'm not going to argue with that. I'm afraid I'm definitely not going to argue with that. It was an interesting thing that someone said a little while ago, and this is moving off topic a little bit, but more what you're talking about here is talking about the future of mankind. Do we want a Star Wars future or a Star Trek future? The Star Wars future is a society of lack, that you're having to get all these things. You're living in deserts, you're living in old buildings are ruined out while there's superpower at the top, incredibly wealthy, the empire, etc., etc. Or the Star Trek, which is the world of plenty, where everyone everyone's got the basic needs are all seen to. We live in a harmonious society. Okay, there are external enemies, but we get on and work together. You know, the society we're living in now is heading down the Star Wars route rather than the Star Trek route. You see what I'm saying? The kind of want and need, the basic needs aren't being fulfilled, that everything seems to be based upon power and control, and it's not allowed to freely evolve. Whereas a better society would go down the Star Trek route, where things are embraced as working together, unified. And I'm not talking about world government, I'm talking about just working together in a fair and equal manner. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation about the potential future we might be facing. And say things like technology of microchipping people, it's just dreadful. I mean, it's awesome. It's awesome. Well, that's wrong, man. It's let me pause for a second there. It's George Orwell. I do apologise. My brain decided to melt for a moment there. It's George Orwell's 1984 world, where everything is being checked and observed, and people even talking about lines in the Bible about, you know, having the mark of the beast on the right hand. It's almost getting to that rather terrifying.
That's your microchip right there. There's your mark of the beast. You know, there's that video that's making the rounds right now showing that company in America. It's microchipping your employee day, and the guy's getting a chip put in his right hand. It's like, you know, and I don't buy the whole mark of the beast from a religious standpoint, but
no, not at all.
But from a predictive standpoint of where we're going as a society, how limiting it is for us as human beings. Your analogy of Star Trek and Star Wars fits perfectly. Are we going to be a species that's constantly struggling against oppression? Or are we going to be a species that advance and spreads out through the cosmos? And hopefully we don't run into the Klingons. But there's a lot of problems in that where we, as a society, we need to get past so many different things. And right now, we are in a crisis mode. And I'm not going to get into politics or anything like that. I'm just going to talk about as evolving as a society, and where I see us devolving is in where we've become a society dependent on entertainment, on instant gratification, and catering. We have corporations, media, commercial, all catering to our basic human instincts of fear, survival, money, fame, power, you know, and they're catering to the lowest common denominator of human emotions in order to make money. And, you know, we have a society, as I've ragged on before, you know, we have our cell phones. All you have to do is walk into public, and half the people out there have their faces plastered to a screen. Or you get a bunch of teens together, and they're not even talking. They're all sitting there looking at their phones. There's no more communication, and there's no more critical thinking. There's no more questioning things. And if you question things, then you're labeled a troublemaker, a heretic, or you know, you're on the quote other side and vilified. And it's, for me, there are so many, our modern society, I don't look at it as being advanced. I look at it as we happen to have great technology, but as a species, we've taken huge step backwards. I think more smaller, tribal, indigenous societies have it way better. Or they had it better before we came along and screwed it up.
Yes.
And maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've grown so big that they're trying to control everybody instead of letting people move forward naturally. That's why we are where we are, because it's all about control. I don't know. You know,
No, I agree with you. I think the biggest element of it is wealth. It is about money. You know, those who control have the money. Those who are in the position of power can increase their financial gain and financial worth and stop the rest of us, basically. You know, I'll be honest with you, Mark, even as few as 5 years ago, perhaps, I might not necessarily agree with what you've been saying there, but I've seen a lot of things happening here that, again, don't go down the road of politics, but have left me wondering, is it just me getting older, or is it really society feels it's going backwards? It does feel like it's becoming less and less cohesive, less and less, the idea of working together for a greater good. I mean, again, I don't want to go too deep in politics, but there has been, a vote that occurred over here about a year and a half ago now that has, it's almost like a civil war the way it's divided the country. It really has split the society in two, and it's going to take a very long time for that to be healed. But is that just an example of what we're talking about here, the lack of cohesion, the lack of, whilst technology is advancing and, that all good that can do for us, but also as people, we're kind of slipping backwards. And as you say, I was in our capital city, London, a little while ago, a couple of days ago, actually, and the number of people who were literally walking around, looking at their phones, and they would stop in the middle of the street, and people walk into them because they've just stopped. Walking around the British Museum. I popped in there because I'm doing some research at the moment on ancient history, which is an interesting time with this, obviously talking to Robert Bauval today. But I was walking around and looking at young people looking at their phones, texting and having Facebook conversations whilst walking around the museum. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, why are you here? What is the point? I mean, if they're looking stuff up, which some kids were actually doing, which is great, that shows the positive side of the technology. They were looking up topics of the items they were looking at. Others, no, they were having conversations. I'm thinking, what is the point if you even come into this building? And yet, unfortunately, that seems to be the way it happens with a lot of the younger people, I'm afraid to say.
Well,
maybe it is me getting old.
It's not just us getting old. It's, and this is a topic for another show, but I think a lot of it's being done on purpose. It's a societal conditioning for whatever reason. I have several theories on that, but again, we only have a couple minutes left in the show, so I'll leave it at that. Thank God.
Let's leave that for the time being.
Yeah. But I mean, I look back. You hear tales of Lemuria, Atlantis. You look at tales that are told in India in the Bhagavad Gita or the Ramayana of these ancient civilizations, even Sumerian civilization, which predates the Egyptians, that have tales of fantastic machines, flying machines, the Indian Vimana, the beings, the Anunnaki coming from space, not like the whole alien Anunnaki thing, but there was advanced technology, whether it was people from other planets or it was our own advanced civilization. But it's still, there's so much evidence out there that we as human beings have been here much longer. We weren't cavemen 20, 30,000 years ago, although some did exist, but I think we still had these big societies, and for whatever reason they disappeared. And it's like if we had a nuclear holocaust now. Let's say we have the big holocaust, Mad Max, everything's now the wasteland. We de-evolved to our basic human survival instincts, and then over time civilization rebuilds itself. And when it does, do we remember what happened before, or is that knowledge lost? Mm-hmm. Are we starting over? And if that's the case, how many times have we started over on this planet? That's something.
I mean, you have the most fundamental problem we have, of course, is the missing link. There still is this issue. Yeah, it looks like we have developed from the apes around us that there is a point in time, there's a divergence, which we still can't fully explain. Well, it's like the basic human appears almost out of the blue. You do wonder, well, if that's one area that's still not explained, although we take evolution as being a definite thing, which I think it is, there is these problems. I mean, a friend of mine actually very interested in that very idea of the prehistoric history, if you like, of there could be evidence of being much, much older civilizations. And he's been highlighting a few kind of examples that could possibly point to hundreds of thousands of years ago of this being some kind of society actually existing, which ties in what you're saying there, that it's been forgotten about, it's been lost. But we know there are many things, even basic things, that we've forgotten how the hell to do that we used to do in ancient times. So yeah, there's certainly a real possibility.
Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of the show. So I want to thank our guest, Robert Bauval, for coming on. And Andy, I really want to thank you also for stepping in. Now, you'll also be back with me next week, too.
I will indeed. I've absolutely loved it for today, and I'm looking forward to the next one as well, definitely.
Well, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio. You'll hear us every Wednesday night from 10 to midnight, Greenwich Mean Time and Eastern Time here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Have a good evening, and we'll catch you all next time. See you later.